Well, hello. I just want to say welcome to everyone and that we are so excited you could all be here for today's webinar. My name is Addison, and I'm going to be going over our agenda as well as helping with this online platform. We will begin with our host, Jonathan Swartz, here introducing our guest speaker. And after the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by our host. After the Q&A portion has concluded, I will share a few announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peace Building, and then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by Jonathan. We hope you are all able to stay until the end, but if you cannot, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zehr Institute's website as well as a YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. Just a brief disclaimer, we do have a secure platform, but in case of disruption, do not attempt to exit. Instead, close your laptop or turn off your device immediately. If this happens, we will resume the webinar again after 10 minutes. For today's webinar, for our Q&A portion, viewers can send questions through the comments. Our host will be facilitating the Q&A portion after the presentation. If you're having a technical issue, please feel free to send a message to me, Addison, using the chat. Again, please use the chat and the comment section to send questions during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this webinar. Now I'm going to pass to Jonathan to introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Addison, and good afternoon, morning, evening from wherever you are. We are excited to have a conversation with Dr. Maisha Winn. And as a way of introducing Dr. Winn, I'm just going to read a few things from the guest bio that's on the screen. So Maisha Winn is the Chancellor's Leadership Professor and the co-founder of I can't read that, for the Transformative Justice in Education Center in the School of Education at the University of California, Davis. Professor Winn's program of research examines the ways in which teachers and/or adult allies for youth in schools and in out-of-school contexts practice justice in the teaching of literacy. Professor Winn was named an American Educational Research Association Fellow. In 2014, she received the William T. Grant Foundation Distinguished Fellowship and was named the American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award recipient in 2012. She's the author of several books, Writing in Rhythm, Spoken Word Poetry in Urban Schools, Black Literate Lives, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, and The School to Prison Pipeline, and co-editor of Humanizing Research, Decolonizing Qualitative Research. She's also the article of numerous articles, and she has two new books, one of which we are going to be discussing in much more depth today, and I think it's from 2016, Justice on Both Sides, Transforming Education Through Restorative Justice, and then the newer Restorative Justice in the English Language Arts Classroom. So we're really excited about this opportunity to have a conversation, and Dr. Winn and I are really approaching this as a conversation. There was not going to be the standard kind of presenting time, but we're just going to have some conversation. So if Addison, could you move us to there? Much better. Dr. Winn, thank you so much for joining us today, and really looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan, and to all of our colleagues at the Zehr Institute, Addison and Patience, who have been also a part of making this happen. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So just some kind of introductory questions. How did restorative justice become a part of your life? So your worldview. How were you first introduced to restorative justice?
Well, that's such a great question. It makes me think of that movie, Love and Hip Hop, when they ask you, when did you first fall in love with hip hop? When did you first fall in love with restorative justice? Well, it's interesting because I can sort of trace it academically, but I do think there's a story as I grew into understanding the paradigm shift that is restorative justice, I feel like there were some seeds that were planted in some of the worldviews of my family that made restorative justice feel like home. Um, there was an incident involving a family member and a situation where they were hurt by strangers. And I remember my mother's response was to not have law enforcement involved.
Mm.
She wanted to see if she could sit down with the family, the parents of the guardians of the other children.
Mhm.
And um, she attempted to do that on her own.
Mhm.
Law enforcement was very eager to get involved, very eager to do their thing. And I
Mhm.
remember how resistant she was to that. She very, I thought, courageously went to the home, tried to engage in a conversation. It didn't go very well
Mhm.
because so many of us are trained to believe that there's only one way to
Mm.
do these things. And the guardian said, hey, the kids blew it, so they get in trouble. Like, we're not gonna have a conversation with you about this.
Mhm.
And I remember how pained my mother was trying to process this, thinking that having the conversation, sitting at the table, figuring it out together would be the way and would actually be a better option for the
Mhm.
folks in this instance who caused the harm. And just even their own, just not really understanding what it was that she was trying to do or wanting to engage. And it was hard. It was a hard thing. So I remember this event and it stays with me. And so later on in my life, when I had the language and discourses around restorative justice, I often think about that incident and think about my mother and just the way that she wanted something different. She
Mhm.
wanted something outside of the existing criminal justice system and processes. But in my professional academic journey, I did this. I participated in this amazing community of women artists in Atlanta. They were actors and set designers and worked with a woman focused theater company. And this woman focused theater company at some point was staging a play called Breath Boom by Kia Corthron. And the play is about girls who are involved in gangs. The setting is the Bronx.
Mm.
And when the actors were preparing for this play, none of them had had any of the experiences of the characters they were playing.
Mm.
Um, and so what was really interesting was that they thought, well, maybe we should, obviously doing research and trying to find out what this might be like. They wanted to engage, have conversation, be in dialogue with girls who had these different kinds of experiences. Um, but they also didn't want to do something where they were just like, tell us all about your life, like just, where they were just taking. And so they created this theater workshop that they actually facilitated in youth detention centers. And that way they could have conversation, but they were also like sharing their knowledge and skill set of writing plays and performing and staging plays. And I remember the director of the program saying, we felt a little nervous and scared because we just didn't know what to expect. And we thought that
Mm.
feeling nervous and scared was a signal that this is something that we should be doing because
Mhm.
there's a lot of unknown and it's making us uncomfortable. And that means we should probably do more of it. So it ended up not being a one-time thing. And they started this program, Playmaking for Girls. And the workshops were done in regional youth detention centers, which I always just plainly say are jails for children.
Mm.
And they're 2-day workshops. And on the first day, there's a lot of ensemble building and community building through theater games. And then there's an opportunity for the girls to write plays. And they're
Mm.
encouraged to write plays about topics that are very relevant to their lives and to use their dialogue and the scenes and the places and the kinds of people they're familiar with.
Mm.
And then on the second day, they actually stage the plays and they perform them for families were invited to come, and other youth who were in the same facility. And in the summer, these girls were, and they were released by summer, they were able to participate in a summer program. So I spent 6 years with this incredible community.
Mm.
And part of what I was trying to understand was the role of playwriting and performance and performing literacy, if you will, as a young person comes to develop what I call a literate trajectory, or seeing themselves as a writer, as a reader, as a speaker, as a doer, as an artist. And one of the things that I learned from the girls is that many of their journeys to the detention center often started from an incident that occurred at school.
Mm.
And what was very unclear was the in-between space, in between the incident that occurred at school and being in a detention center at the end of the day, and your parent finding out after they got off work, after they picked up another sibling from school, and no one knew this was going to happen. No one had an inkling. It just wasn't something that anybody thought was possible. And to feel like it's just so random that you could end up in jail when you went to school that morning, and that it would not even, there was nothing that you could imagine happening during that day that would get you there, is incredibly. And the more that I worked with these girls, who I refer to as student artists, and the more I learned these different stories, I just thought there has to be something in between these two spaces. They just can't be like, you get in trouble for something and then you go to jail from the school. And just as I would be in conversation with people, talking to people, learning from people, one of the offerings that many people made, suggested, talked about was this thing called restorative justice. And I, at the time, didn't really have the blueprint for it. I didn't know it. I felt like, like I said, I felt like I knew it in my heart once I understood what it was, but I never heard that language. In 2012, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison from Emory University. And the first thing that I did was set up a restorative justice training with my mentor and first RJ teacher, Sujatha Baliga. And we got Sujatha to come out to Madison. I remember she tried to resist because she was kind of like not doing trainings then, but I was like, nope, they told me to get you. You're going to do this. And that was the start of a long, beautiful friendship and sisterhood that still continues. And so I organized faculty, students, educators, community folks, and we jumped in on this 5-day restorative justice training. So I would say formal tools in education really started with Sujatha.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. Such a wonderful description of like the learning this through like everyday life experiences, right? And somehow I love the description of how I would describe it, your mother's like intuitive sense that like the systems available won't meet the needs that actually exist, and may actually increase the needs in different ways as well. And so what do we need to do when there needs to be something different?
Right.
Love that.
And this idea that it's hard, even if that different way of thinking might benefit someone, that we're all such in a punitive mindset, and we're so entrenched in that culture that we punish ourselves and each other and the people we love, and we think, nope, this is the way to do this. Like they have to learn a lesson, So I'll never forget that.
Yeah. No, that's a perfect segue of you using the word mindset, a perfect segue into another question. One of the things I noticed fairly early on when I was reading Justice on Both Sides is you talk about justice work as mindset work. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what do you mean by mindset work in referring to justice work?
Sure. So I started my career as an elementary school teacher. I taught first grade. I taught also 9th and 10th grade English at high school. And so as a teacher, as an educator, we tend to think about practice a lot. So we want to jump right into practice. What do we do on Monday? What's that lesson plan going to be? What does all of this mean? And the way that as an education researcher, I was trying to understand restorative justice in general. So my first teacher is someone who did this work in systems, criminal justice systems, working with district attorneys, judges. And I wanted to really learn RJ in that context so that I would, understand what fidelity needed to be paid to it. Because I know that sometimes when things are imported into schools, they look very different. And they did. I think most people thought about restorative justice in schools as just being in the circle, which is a process that is leveraged at times to engage in restorative justice work and transformative possibilities, but it's not restorative justice. And I argue all throughout my work that this notion of restorative practice, which I think taking justice out of restorative justice, is incredibly problematic. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice because we lose the focus, the North Star, why we should be doing the work in the first place. So for me, the mindset piece is, when you saw schools adopting what they would call restorative justice or restorative practice, restorative practices, you saw the practice of the circle. You saw people coming into this, physical space. But certain things still didn't change. You still had a lot of power dynamics. You still had racial disparities in who was being suspended and expelled. You still had awkward power dynamics within the circle. Sometimes you didn't necessarily have the child who allegedly caused the harm having an advocate. Sometimes it was like a circle that was really telling you the things that you did wrong. So you just saw all these different variations. And so to me, I thought, if we could be thinking about how we train the mind to be in the spirit and the service of restorative justice, that's the work that really needs to be done. Because we can all jump in the circle and pretend we're doing this. But if fundamentally the big shifts don't happen, where we're really thinking about how we're in relationship with each other, how racist ideas impede our ability to be in a healthy, right relationship with each other, the practice, the circle, the this, the that, the talking piece, they don't matter. So that is really how I started to conceptualize the pedagogical stances, because I really tried to step back and I looked at 2 decades of my own research with educators who have been, so beloved by their students and had a great presence in their community. What were the kinds of stances, beliefs that they had in their work that carried them, So when I try to understand, what was it that they brought to the work? What were their philosophies? What was, sort of the purpose of education as far as they were concerned? I came up with these stances, and they are history matters, race matters, justice matters, language matters, and later a 5th stance, futures matter. And I thought, if we could just say that we believe that these things matter, and create our own container, if you will, for these different stances, and then be able to think about how these stances are in conversation with our context, because I try not to prescribe too much in the stances. I think they change in different places, but they are a container and a place for us to start certain kinds of conversations that can get our minds right so that we can actually do this work.
Yeah, yes. That whole idea of like paradigm shift, of like changing lenses, some of Howard Zehr's writing, that the idea that like there's something about the lenses through which we see the paradigms that we are trained up in relatively both implicitly and explicitly, right? As we grow up, both in school and outside of our school, that get that kind of punitive, retributive sort of mindset is such a, like, that feels like the default. And I love how you're referring to, like, actually we gotta undo so much of those default settings, and that's mindset work. That's paradigm shifting. Love that. I'm going to quote something. We're going to get a little more into depth on the pedagogical stances in a second. So I love that you've already kind of got us headed in that direction. But I'm just going to read a quote from the book, from Justice on Both Sides, which I think really brings out some of what you're talking about in terms of mindset change. In the book, you write, and this is a quote: "To practice restorative justice, one must not only be committed to seeing the full humanity of others, but also be open to the possibility of not always being right, but instead making things right. Restorative justice is not merely an alternative to punishment; it is a way of life." Can you say just a little more of how did you come to that perspective? I mean, I think it is like it's interwoven in all that you've said so far, but I think there's such a in institutional life, in educational life, in the life of educators. So much of this can be based like programmatic, right? Like, how do we start a restorative justice program? How do we start which may be great, but as you said, like it may not actually change anything. You may still have the same injustices occurring, but now under a different name. But can you say a little more how did you come to that kind of way of restorative justice as a way of life?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I think in the readings of work like Zehr and Pranis, Fania Davis's work, really thinking about justice and equity work over time, I really came to understand that you have to really immerse yourself in this thought. So I also just want to say that even though I'm a researcher and a scholar, I don't just see myself as someone who studies restorative and transformative justice. I really try my best to live it, and it's really hard. You have to, it has to be active, right? It has to be active in every place in your life, in your partnerships, your parenting, your friendships. And I think all of us, the one thing that I learned is we're all invested in being right. We're trained to be right. We're trained to want to have the right and the correct answers. It's a part of our schooling system in our country. Having the right answer, being celebrated for being correct, for having the right piece of information. And so it's no surprise that we we want to be the right person, right? But I think this difference between making things right and being right, there's just it's such a beautiful distinction. And in the making things right, it is so liberating because you realize you don't have to be right. And I just even think about it with regards to my own parenting, like inviting my children to start using that language so young. Like I remember I remember when my kids are 11 and 8 now, but when my oldest was like 4 and my youngest was 1 and something, but talking. And I'd been teaching them, instead of saying sorry for something, ask what can I do to make it right? And trying to have them do that with each other. And I remember I said that to my youngest guy, and my older kiddo at 4, he said, "Well, mommy, he doesn't even know all that. Like, he doesn't know what that is." And like, but he will. But he was, nobody knows what that is. And it was just so funny because, I just said if I could start in the culture of it and get them in the culture of this, and it does change things. My 8-year-old said the other day, he said, "Mom, you know how you tell me, not to say sorry because sorry doesn't really do anything, but try to figure out what it is I can do to get it right." And I'm like, yeah, that's very true. And as a parent, you're having to take, a step back. You're having to admit wrongdoing. You're having to lean in and say, I wish I would have handled that a little differently. You're having to say that to colleagues. You're having to say that to friends, to partners. So it has to be something that you're constantly working at, and that you can be honest about, as honest as you possibly can, right?
Yeah.
I think it's hard, but we always talk about how do we live outside the circle? Like things can be so powerful in the circle, but what is it that we want to take outside with us? How do I want to take that outside when I'm working with my students, with my grad students, with my undergraduate students? And how I really want them to have that for each other, not just with me, but for themselves. And so some of the work that I think has been really powerful for me to engage in is how we think about bringing restorative justice into the teaching of particular disciplines.
Yeah.
Like, how can we leverage restorative justice when we're thinking about teaching math and science and social studies and English language arts and digital media arts? And I'm not smart enough to figure all that out by myself. I have lots of amazing colleagues throughout the country who came together to really help me understand and think about that.
Mhm.
My math friends came to the table, my science friends came to the table
Yeah.
because I knew they would have a better way of thinking about it.
Mhm.
But that how is it that we just integrate it into even the way that we're planning for the material, the materials that we're going to use, the examples that we're going to have, the reading that we're going to assign, the way that we're going to engage each other in class, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I recently picked up I think it's an edited volume, Restorative Justice in Education, that your recent edited volume that came out, and that is such an incredible resource for y'all that are watching, that are educators yourselves. It basically takes different disciplines and looks at, in my way of describing it would be how to take seriously these pedagogical stances as they relate to restorative justice in teaching, for educators to teach particular subject matter, particular areas. So I've found that to be incredibly helpful. And you're right, looked like a wonderful grouping of colleagues and folks engaged in that. Engaged
Yeah.
in that group.
I'm really proud of that work. We have teachers, we have researchers, we have practitioners. One of the pieces, just as an example for those of you who are not familiar with the Restorative Justice in Education book, it's edited by myself and Lawrence Winn. My colleague Alexis Patterson, who is a professor at the University of California, Davis in science ed, her longtime collaborator, Dr. Selena Gray, who was a middle school science teacher for years in Southern California. They introduce what they call a holistic science pedagogy, for example. I'd love to just give this example. And what they do is they really think about the ways in which the three questions of restorative justice could be applied to the teaching of science. And their sort of overarching questions are: who's been harmed in science? What are their needs? And who is obligated to meet these needs, and what can science teachers do about these needs?
Mm.
And they offer this really amazing lesson plan around the Flint water crises, where they ask the questions around. They actually pose these questions to students to process who was harmed
Mm.
and what needs to be done. And it's a really powerful lesson plan that's embedded in their chapter. And so I really, really like, that's why I really love that volume, because you have educators grappling with in real time, like what this looks like, how it shows up. And I think sometimes we default and we say, oh, we can let the social studies teachers do this, or the
Mm-hmm.
English teachers, they already do Socratic seminar. They can do this stuff. And we don't always have the models and the examples for other disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So many good entrances into the whole conversation of harm. I mean, when you think about climate change and like, what if we think beyond humans being harmed? That's significantly important. But like, what about the earth itself experiencing harm? What would it look like to repair? Who's obligated to do that? Participate in that process. Love that. Love that. Can we take a few minutes and just dive a little bit deeper into the pedagogical stances?
Sure.
Just to kind of review, the four pedagogical stances for practicing restorative justice in education are, let me see if I can read them in order.
I'm going to quiz you. This is the
Yeah,
quiz.
right. History matters, race matters, justice matters, and language matters. So can you just take us briefly through just a little bit of like, what do you mean by history matters, and how does that relate to restorative justice in education?
Yeah. So I do want to say, and I think this is really important, that I think that there are many other ways of mattering. So these matters, if you will, I invite people to think about other stances. For example, I have a colleague, Casey Phillip Wong, who has written a position paper on power matters, and we're going to actually be putting that on our website. I love what he did with this. So I invite people to really think even more expansively than I have about these stances. History, for me, is a place that we always have to start. I initially thought about this stance because I thought about Chris Gutierrez's work around developing socio-critical literacies, where we historicize ourselves in efforts to connect with other people's histories, and then we kind of map those on with each other. But I also think when we're thinking about being a community of practice, that like circles can create this space where we can historicize ourselves and we can be in charge of sharing our lived experiences that we feel people need to know to understand who we are. And then we're connecting those with other people. But I also think communities of practice have to think about the history of their organizations or their groups, whether it's their school or another kind of community of practice. You know, who was this place originally created for? How does it look? How different is it? You know, how the constituents, have they changed? How have they changed? What do these changes mean? When people are thinking about like the good old days here, what are they talking about? You know, what are these different shifts? And so I think History Matters is really an invitation for people to understand those histories at the local, very local, me, myself, and I level,
Yep.
the folks with them, and also institutional history and memory. Race Matters is largely inspired by a lot of my reading and thinking of work by Angela Davis. I think that she has some really powerful ideas around the ways in which racism has been very disruptive to children's futures, particularly Black children, and you know it racism and racist ideas have actually impacted the way that these young people have been able to see or not see a future for themselves. And I think some of Ibram Kendi's earlier work from his book Stand from the Beginning around racist ideas very much informed that second stance. I think this idea that we learn racist ideas and that we can actively unlearn them, which I think has a lot to do with the way that we keep trying to be a restorative justice person, you know, and not just practice it, but, you know, be that person, is something that Kendi offers. And so I also want to say that there's a lot of intersectionality, you know, with the stances. So I see History Matters and Race Matters as having a profound relationship. When I first thought about these two together, I really thought about the work of Brian Stevenson, and he wrote the book Just Mercy. And after he wrote that book and did all of this work defending and in many cases liberating many people of African descent on death row, who were on death row. People asked him, like, what's next for you? Like, where do you go from here? What do you do? And he talked about the fact that history had to be the next move, the next step. And he said that until our country really comes to terms with dealing with the racial terror that is a part of our fabric, and really thinking about how racism is an illness and a disease that is in all of our bodies that we have to actively fight, that was very impactful for me in terms of thinking about what do we have to keep center. Again, a stance is how you ground yourself. It's like your guide. I see someone in comments talked about the signposts of Zehr. Absolutely. All of these really critical pieces to kind of keep us focused on it, because it's easy to blow around and it's easy to have some situation take you off guard. But if you really sit in a particular space with yourself and come back, if you have, you know, foundation, hopefully you come back to that. Justice Matters, I think, is such an important stance. I like to think a lot about justice projects. I love Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang talk about engaging in justice projects. And one of their tenets of justice projects is that we're not going to spend a bunch of time trying to convince people that somebody's humanity is valuable. Like we're fast forwarding past that, because You know, like
Yeah.
like that's just like that's bare minimum. That's like basic. Like we're trying to go get past that. And so what does it mean to tap into the justice movements of the past,
Mm,
those of the present?
mm,
One of the questions that I like to ask for people who participate in restorative justice circles with me or with my center is we talk about what justice movements have impacted you. Like if you
mm,
could kind of put
mm,
yourself in the middle of a particular movement, whether you were living at the time or not, or a kid, or whatever the case may be, what speaks to you? Like if you see the pictures or the footage, and it's just really interesting to hear people talk about different movements that they feel compelled by or called by.
mhm,
Um, and then the fourth stance is language matters. And I think that with educators in particular, the language matters stance is so important. I think that we have done a lot of work around how we speak to people in ways that try to make them feel whole and intact. There's a lot of attention to teacher talk. But what we don't always pay attention to are the conversations that happen behind closed doors when the children are not in front of you, when their families are not in front of you, the coded language that we use, the way that we talk about families. I firmly
mm,
believe that
mm,
we cannot tear down children's families and then expect to, smile in their children's face and be of service to them if we really are using, you know, um, unkind words and ways of talking about their families. And so language matters was my attempt to kind of help people think about the ways in which, we are not just in conversation with the person in front of us, but like behind the closed doors, we have to be in service of and practicing the right kinds of
mm,
discourses.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
I also really think just now to tie the history, the race and justice and language together, I want to also really lift up again. Angela Davis has this wonderful book about the meaning of freedom, and she talks about how we all need to develop these critical vocabularies to talk
mm,
about race and racism. And even later, she talks about, gender identity, like how
mhm,
I saw her speak at UW-Madison before the pandemic in 2019, and she said, there used to be a time where she thought she'd go to sleep at night and she and her colleagues would wake up and the revolution would be there, and she said maybe we weren't ready, maybe we didn't really have the language that the young people have now to talk about gender identity,
mm,
and that how our young people have such a facility with words and language and naming in a
mm,
way that we didn't necessarily have access to. So she's been a big, supporter of people gaining what she calls these critical vocabularies to talk about race and racism.
yeah,
And so those were the first four stances.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's a good segue into like the fifth one. And I really do appreciate you naming the how stances stand together, the kind of intersections. Like these are all it's they're not separate, and they're not the only ones that could be, right? Like there are many other stances that are possible. But can you tell us a little bit about the fifth more recent stance that you've added?
Yeah, so I think like anyone, any scholar, sometimes you're revisiting your work and you make mistakes and grow and you learn. Hopefully, you're growing and you're learning with the work. And I think it was um, uh, an omission, an unfortunate omission. This fifth stance, futures matter. I I just think that there's so many times that I would be talking about future and futures of young people in my work, but for some reason I wasn't naming it. And I really have my colleague Anna Stetsenko, who's at the CUNY Graduate Center, to thank for this because I was giving a talk at the Literacy Research Association, and it was this wonderful setup where it was like 2-day session in the middle of a conference where we got to come back and talk with the same group,
Awesome.
and it was just really, it was wonderful. I don't know what they called it, but it was lovely. And so Anna Stetsenko was partnered with me to like not just be a discussant, but be in dialogue like we are. And, she, was carefully listening to everything that I was saying. And she just said, Maisha, I just feel like every time I hear you talk about this work, there's a fifth stance that you're talking about it, but you're not naming it. You have this fifth stance that you're talking about with futures. And it was just so true. And, I don't know, I didn't know if maybe I didn't want to go back and do the work. I don't know. So I loved her intellectual challenge. And I loved the pushing. And that's what good colleagues do is, they inspire and encourage. And so I just kind of went and sat with that for a while, and started to do some writing. And I started to go back and look at places where I was kind of on the cusp of talking about this, but not talking about it, and trying to figure out what was the next move. And I think sometimes because sometimes people use the word future and people get freaked out. They start thinking about, like crystal balls, and they get all worked up about futures and futurity. But there are really connected, grounded ways in Indigenous cultures and African cultures around futures and thinking generations out. And we may not see it as futures work, but it is futures work. Yeah. And so for me, that pedagogical stance, futures, and it's plural, matter, is so important, because when I think about all this work we're doing, why are we doing it? We're doing it because we want our young people to be able to see many paths forward for themselves and for their families and their communities. And so how do we really think about and reclaim this idea that everyone has a future, and that people can imagine, dream, and plan for a future that they desire and deserve?
Yeah. That's such a good way of naming it. It's like it's implicit throughout, and I would even say like it's implicit. Like we do education because futures matter, right? Like it's kind of like a base. Like why would we do education if we didn't imagine that there was there was a future? But the direct naming of it and then connecting it to these various the various other stances, I think, is really important. And we've got a couple. Oh, there's actually a question here right now that I think we can just sort of address, because it's related to what we were just talking about. Do you mean futures of individuals or of broader communities?
Yeah, I think Kathy is right to ask this question, because it's really both. You're absolutely right. It needs to be about both. And I really think that it's important to think about collective futures. I think we're in this moment, right? The pandemic has made us think about that. Are we thinking about my individual future? Or are we thinking about our futures, and how really we need each other for our futures, going back to the climate conversation that we were talking about at the beginning of our session together. We really need each other. So yes, absolutely, individual and broader communities, much like history. Historicizing myself and hearing you historicize yourself, and then also us historicizing the space that we're in, how we both came to be here, what existed here before we were here, what kind of culture was already here, the full story. So yes, all of the stances are meant to really think about the self, the community, and the larger institution.
Yeah, absolutely. The book has I'm going to kind of shift gears just a little bit in the couple minutes before we really open it up to questions and comments from those that are joining us. But the book has an extended and in my mind incredibly important section that discusses this idea of restorative justice labor. And you kind of directly name the disparities that exist in where the load lands for paradigms within schools. Disparities rooted in race and gender, often in our histories. Can you say a little bit more about that observation?
Absolutely. When you're not looking for something and it's there. First of all, I want to say justice on both sides is, an ethnography of one particular high school community. But I have to tell you, when I share the work around the gendering of restorative justice work, people are like raising their hands and falling out and like agreeing and, just really they just grab onto it because they see it in their own organizations. So one of the things came out in this particular school community is the opportunity for high school students to be trained to be student circle keepers. It was optional, for students to participate in this. But when you looked at the roster of who was doing the circle keeping work, they were largely African American girls, primarily, and boys, white girls, Latinx students, queer students, and even on the administrative side, women of whatever race. And I think that one of the things that really struck me is who's the person to do the RJ work? Like, is it women's work? Is it the work of queer folks? Is it the work of folks of color? Like, who's supposed to do this work? Because when I'm in these communities, these are the people who are trying to hold people accountable and make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do. But then that labor is exhausting. I talk about the student Viola in the book, and how, at one point she just kind of had a little meltdown because she just said she was doing so much for the school, and she was an African American girl. She was the spokesperson for this and that. She was the model for how to do this, how to do that. And she just wanted to kind of be a student and like go to PE and, just kind of be with her senior class and not be so socially responsible for solving everybody's problems. And so it's interesting because it was this catch-22. I think for many of the students who were involved, it was like this honor to be seen as someone who could engage in this work. It also, there's a lot of research and work done around the adultification of Black girls and Black girls being used in their classes to manage the class and be helpers and this sort of thing. And so that is something that I, talk about and write about in that particular chapter in Justice on Both Sides. Of course, there are other people who talk about this work in powerful ways. Monique Morris talks about this work. There's other scholars, Venus Evans Winters, just a lot of amazing people. So all this to say that I think that the girl who's doing the work.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you for that. One question, and then we'll get to some other, one last question from me, and then we'll get to some other questions from folks. Because futures matter, what do you see in the future of restorative justice in education? What are the next challenges? What are the next opportunities that you see?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think there are a lot of opportunities, especially as many of our young people returned to school after being sheltered in place. I also think we have to learn from the families who chose not to return to school. There are lots of stories of families opting into homeschooling and cooperative schooling with fellow parents. They feel they can't go back. They received less calls and emails about all the things that were wrong with their children, and it felt good. It felt good to be with their kids, to reconnect with their learning, and not be under assault of critique, and figuring out that I've just got to do what I'm doing and hold tight to this. So I think we have to learn some of the lessons around who didn't come back to the building, and try to learn about coming back to the building that we were all so eager to get back to, because we missed being in person, we missed our colleagues, we missed the laughter, the chattiness that people may have found annoying prior to the pandemic and were desiring it afterwards. I think that these last 2 years are the embodiment, the living, breathing, true meaning of what restorative justice is. It goes back to me to Fania Davis's definition of restorative justice, we're being an interrelated web, and anything that hurts one part hurts the whole thing. And we can't make it without each other. We're not going to make it without each other. And I know that we're not all on the same page about that. But that's the reality, that we all need to do this. So I was so hopeful. I am still going to be hopeful that this might be a moment where we really see the need to bring people in restorative justice conversations and really try to make this the way that we do business. Because we're all trying to get back in this space together. The parents, the teachers, the administrators, the staff, the kids, everybody. We're all trying to do this. we need some support structures for this.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So both challenge, but also opportunity. I mean, then
Yeah.
those often go together, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to open it up to questions from you all that have been listening in and watching this. What are some of the things that you would like to know, or that you'd like to ask? Let's start with this one question from Addison. What are some of the biggest obstacles you have experienced trying to help a community, maybe an educational community or community, however you define, implement restorative justice practices, and how have you helped overcome those?
Well, if we take education community, for example, I think what's really important is you have to have the support of leadership.
Mhm.
Because a teacher can be all in on this work, but there has to be a bigger infrastructure for this.
Mhm.
We had 3 practitioners in residence from an amazing school in LA, Roosevelt High School, Roxana Duenas and Eddie Lopez, Jorge Lopez. And what's so amazing about their implementation of restorative justice in their ethnic studies classrooms is that their principals and assistant principals support the work, and
Mhm.
they make space for it to be a part of what the school does.
Yeah.
And so I see that whenever we're working with teams, we worked with a school district, for example, in Sacramento, and the superintendent and her cabinet, we started with training them, and then we spent 1 year just visiting every single school in their district, meeting the parents, focus groups with students, with staff,
Yeah.
and with teachers, just understanding where we were before we ever got into any sort of training work. And
Mhm.
so I think that having that longer term plan as opposed to seeing it as I'm going to do this for PD this one day, it's always about the long
Yeah.
haul, and trying to make it a part of your culture, and that takes
Mhm.
time.
Yep.
So typically when the Transformative Justice and Education Center, TJE Center, that I'm co-director and co-founder of with Lawrence Winn, one of the things that we do is when we work with people, we usually map it out over a year, an academic year, instead of a like one-time workshop today and then
Yeah.
boom, see you later.
Yeah.
That's it, because we find that you need that ongoing conversation, and it needs to be sustained.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, the like proliferation of like quick professional development opportunities is like, yeah, is wonderful. And it also like contributes to the kind of fix it mentality that I think we sometimes have, and we kind of connect that to something like restorative justice. Like, oh, it's this amazing thing and it can fix all of your problems, right? And it's like, well, um, not 2 hours in a PD session, right? Like, let's map this out so we can actually like wrestle more with some of these concepts and the ideas and the history and how history matters and how race matters, and like all of those things that are connected to the present for sure, and are connected to the future. I love this idea of like enculturating, RJ. Like, I think there's lots of conversations about like institutionalizing it, which is in some ways a different conversation, but sort of like, how does it get to be, this is the way that we do things, right? Or like, this is the way things are done around here. That's culture.
Yeah.
So how do we move? We have to move. We have to move together for
Yeah,
that kind of change to happen.
that's right.
Yeah, and so my awareness is that sometimes what like we've got just a lot of individual teachers, individual practitioners who are like all in, but then
Yeah.
frustrated when when it's like, and there's no support for it.
Yeah, they need support.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It sounds like we're having some Facebook streaming issues and some
Oh,
other streaming issues, but let's keep going, and we'll have the video of this that we'll put on the YouTube
okay.
channel later. What are some of the most what's something that a student has taught you over the years?
Oh, so many things. Well, first of all, I will start with justice on both sides. That is a quote directly from the student Viola, who I just thought was she was just so brilliant when she talked about restorative justice as thinking about justice on both sides, like being able to think about many different perspectives. And so the reason why that landed on the cover of the book is because I just found that just so profound. And young people, I think, just have they have such clarity sometimes that we don't have. They have clarity with the language, with the ideas. And they just call it like they see it, you know? And so one of the things that I felt like I learned so much from the students I worked with at Kennedy High School, the pseudonym of the school, was that they really grappled with the notion of restorative justice because they too had mostly been introduced to a punishment culture. Many of them said things like, I thought you do something wrong. Oh, well, you're in trouble. You go to jail. Bye. Like, that's it. You know, like there was no gray area. Something else that I learned from the young people was that confidentiality almost felt like a new word to them.
Yeah.
It was like new vocabulary. And I never thought about that because if you think about social media and having so many aspects of people's lives being public or being made public, and if you didn't grow up with that, it's not you know how confidentiality is, right? You know, it's like you can't tweet out somebody's secret or post somebody's bad hair day, or just we didn't have those tools.
Right.
And so when they talked about in learning or relearning or reconnecting with the notion of confidentiality through their training, restorative justice training, I found that really powerful. Like, I don't have to go and tell everybody that this person said this. And I could actually go and talk to this person myself instead of making this a big public ugly thing, because it's just going to get worse. Like that they're learning those processes. And this to me is a perfect example of when educators and young people, like we see things so clearly, at least we think we do, and we don't understand why they do what they do, right? But we're also not really putting ourselves in their time and space because we don't have the knowledge of what it's like to grow up like that, and like in that moment coming of age when everything is so public, when personal business is right there and people are willingly sharing everything. So I thought that idea of taking confidentiality for granted just kind of blew my mind. I also just learned about, of course, when I look back at my own, particularly high school experiences, I know this to be true, but the culture of the hallway, like the way that students sort among themselves, right? The sorting starts early. It doesn't start when we're adults. Like people start deciding there's a person I can be friends with and there's a person who I can't. And they make those determinations based on lots of external factors. And then they're getting in those circles and they're like, wow, this person's really interesting, or I really like them. I'd love to know more about them, or they're not who I thought they were. And so just how young and early a lot of the sorting and the cutting off of possible relationships and friendships, can take place so early without that in-depth interaction. So we need to introduce our young people to these opportunities as soon as possible. I've also learned from preschool kids. I did some circle work around friendship in my children's preschools years ago. And, one of the preschool teachers said something about like, you already start seeing you can't come to my birthday party. You can't do, like a lot of this little stuff. And it seems little, but he was very concerned about this bigger, like what was behind it and where that was, the mean culture. Like, he was really trying to figure out how do we support them in thinking about another way of being. And I remember the first round in the circle, and I remember Nuri Nusrat, who's a restorative justice attorney in the Bay Area. Nuri actually, I said, Nuri, I gotta figure out how to start the circle. And she said, maybe you should just pass the talking piece around and let them just hold it. Like, cause they're going to be curious about it and you're passing, you're going to play with it. And I said, you're right. So we just did a round where they just held the talking piece. And of course, some kids were doing funny stuff with it and just get that out of their system and then like come back to another round. And in that second round, I just said, so what's a friend? What is a friend? What are the kinds of things that friends say? What are the kinds of things that friends do? And they had so much to say, and they're like 4, and they had so many good ideas. So I feel like the other thing I've learned from from students is that you can't start these conversations too soon. As a matter of fact, the sooner the better.
No, absolutely, absolutely. What about doing this work has brought you joy?
Oh, so
Is there a
much.
story that comes to mind?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, that preschool story, I just think about those kiddos so much. They're so cute. But also, I will say this, during well, we're still in the pandemic. Sorry, I kind of like don't know where we are with this.
Yeah.
Nobody else does either. So I will say when we were sheltered in place,
Yeah.
um, if you would have asked me 2.5 years ago if you could do restorative justice work on a Zoom, do a circle on these platforms, I probably would have told you no.
Mhm.
And I would have opted out of any such thing. I have to tell you, some of the most beautiful relationships
Mm.
uh, and connections in circle I have taken place on these digital platforms over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
People coming with their hearts. I don't know if it's because you're at home and you feel comfortable, you're not at work. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I have been completely humbled by the way people have shown up in this space.
Mhm.
And if there's a desire to connect and do the work, we're
Mhm.
gonna get the work done no matter what.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's what I've learned and I know. And I feel like I may have been a little bit, self-righteous about like the in-person, we need this, it has
Mhm.
to be this way,
Mhm.
yes, I'm guilty. That was me. And so it's been really beautiful to see people take these tools.
Mhm.
My grandmother used to say, take what you got and make what you want.
Mhm.
And that's what people are doing. They're taking what they got and they're making what they want. And
Yeah.
so if you want to do the work, you're going to find a way to do the work.
Yeah. 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 Those adaptations that we don't think can happen, or we're like, no, like I'm the same. I was like, no, it has to be in person. Like we can't generate the same kind of like atmosphere. And then, like 6 months later, I'm like crying over Zoom, like, so like, yeah, it's totally possible. And like the almost like forced imagination that like, okay, here's our reality. So what are we going to do with it? Like, how are we going to maintain connections or create new ones, given this new reality?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. People just want to jump into this. And, I remember probably the first circle process that we did on Zoom. And I remember the first person in the round, they spoke a very hard truth. They kind of
Mhm.
broke down. And I remember the person after them said, "Oh, so we're doing this for real."
Yeah,
and then, and after that, it was like everybody came with it.
yeah,
Like they were like, "Oh, we're doing this
yeah,
for real,
yeah. I thought we were just performing this. Like, no, we're doing it for real.
for real."
Yeah. No,
And
absolutely.
after that, everybody just jumped in.
Yeah. Well, and I
Yeah.
think that's a piece that for me connects to like what you were talking about confidentiality and privacy. For like, this is a new world for us folks who are maybe a little bit older and less removed from the kind of like, we still remember when we didn't have cell phones that we carried around, right? Or like when they didn't even exist.
Right.
But to me, that's like a really, I think it's a really helpful connection or recognition that like, oh yeah, there are ways to connect, that are maybe different than what I know, and that doesn't make them less valuable, and may actually make them more valuable. May create new ways to connect to different people.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I want to ask you a question about your context, educating educators, but your day-to-day work context is in the context of a university, right? Like in the context of a higher ed, an institution of higher education. Um, many of I think many people experience higher ed as a very hierarchical structure, very in some ways resistant to the kinds of um, ways of seeing justice, of moving towards justice that we've been talking about. And sometimes that affects workplace culture, like, and how we do this with our colleagues. Can you talk a little bit about like any experiences that you've had of like what does it mean to like walk the talk in your like workplace setting?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've been really, really fortunate when I say we, my center, the TJE Center, in that the larger campus, and this really came certainly after summer 2020. Our Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Renetta Toll, Dr. Toll was really thinking about how to bring some of the principles of community to light.
Mm-hmm.
She was very interested in the 5 pedagogical stances, as possibly thinking about how the entire campus community might leverage them. And so it was a wonderful challenge because initially we really thought about our work as part of the P through 12
Mm-hmm.
space and not necessarily higher ed space. And so her intellectual and challenge of really thinking about what this work, how it might show up for our colleagues, was really powerful. And so we actually have created these workshops for different units on campus to learn about the pedagogical stances and restorative justice. And it has been amazing because we suggest to the different units, departments, you know, we've worked with our development team, we've worked with our basketball teams, coaches and players together, mixed. We've worked with different departments, academic departments. We invite them to assemble a diverse group of like 20 to 25 folks who would then kind of go back and share the work with the rest of the community. And we try to make sure we have all the representation. So if it's an academic department, there are students, there are staff, there are faculty. So when you talk about power dynamics, just the fact that you have people who are willing to come into this space and then be a model to other folks who, have shared identity titles is very powerful. So we have created a way to invite our colleagues in at the university into this conversation, and it's been amazing.
Yeah.
I another thing that maybe 2-3 years ago, I wouldn't have been as clear as I am now.
Yeah.
Not only I always had a sense that it was needed, but how possible it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. The whole idea of like, we can't really do for others that which we are unwilling to do for ourselves. And so that idea of like, it actually matters how we are outside of the circle, outside of the classroom. I love that. I love that language. And then how does that relate to people that we are in relationship with? If relationships are central, what does that mean for all of our relationships?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What
Rita Alfred, I don't, Rita?
I know of, yes. Yeah.
Rita's really helped me think about that work too. I think Rita, I've worked with her in a couple of different contexts, but she is someone who really, I think, knows how to help us think about what work needs to be done, regardless of where we are, what our institutions are, like just kind of get us back focused on what needs to be done. So she's been very instrumental in helping me understand and think about how to get everybody back to this same starting line, so to speak.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you enjoy talking about that we haven't talked about? What's the favorite class that you've taught recently?
Well, I just taught an incredible class. So it's a trilogy of classes. I teach one of them, but I work really closely with colleagues. We have a program at UC Davis called Quarter at Aggie Square. So Davis is in Davis on Pat Winn land, and then Sacramento is on Nisenan land, and it's about 20 minutes away. You have to cross something called the Causeway, and the UC Davis Medical Center is actually in Sacramento. And so there's some space that is being developed where students will be able to have classes. And my my team was a part of starting this program called Quarter at Aggie Square, where we actually taught students in Sacramento, in the community, made sure they met people who were a part of the community. And I have to tell you, such an incredible, this is our second year doing it. We did do the first fall 2020 virtually, and then fall 2021 was in person. And what was so amazing is we were able to connect our students with educators, with people in theater, with people who are doing community work, people in sports entertainment industry in Sacramento, to really kind of have a more robust sense of the city that they are right up against, right next to. But sometimes our students don't venture over here, and to really humanize the city and have there be like a reciprocal, exchange of energy and ideas and creativity with students and key players in the city. So that class is amazing. It's a small class, and my colleagues and I have this cohort who we work with. So it's really nice because the cohort of students also get really, really close. And so what's really nice, like in my class and even one of my co-teachers' classes, we can do circles, we can do check-ins with our students. They're like 3-hour seminars once a week, so you have a nice chunk of time to really connect and have really kind of diversify the day, if you will. So that's one of my favorite classes, and I'm getting ready to teach a graduate seminar called Humanizing Research. I'm teaching that in the spring, and I can't wait.
Yeah. Wonderful. A question here. How do you see restorative justice as a tool for disrupting the criminalization of Black girls in school systems, as Monique W. Morris puts it?
Yeah, I think I've alluded to this in just in the opening. The work with the theater company was certainly part and parcel of this, of this larger journey trek through and with restorative justice. Many of the girls who were in our program were African American girls, and they were the highest percentage of girls who were in these youth detention centers. So I've been paying attention to that in my work for a very, very long time, and thinking about why it's so important to leverage restorative justice. Again, not locating the problem in the girls themselves, but the mindset work of the people who are around them.
Yep.
So, like, to me, some of the work around this, it seems to be really focused on the girls, but it's really what people are projecting onto them that is the issue, which takes me right on back to the stances.
Yep.
So if we go back to these stances, for example, when I was looking at these student artists and thinking with them and learning from them, I if you will, of women of African descent, women who were involved in slavery abolition, and women like Sojourner Truth, who, when they first would get up and speak in these public spaces, that first of all, women would never be thought of as being able to speak at a podium or on a stage or be elevated in any kind of way, and Black women certainly weren't. I contextualized their lives as artists and performers and as speakers and doers in these larger histories of Black women who were often silenced. And so the History Matter stance, to me, really comes into play when I'm thinking about this. There is a long history of Black women being denied the opportunity of being seen as women, as being human. And so the way that Black girls are treated is all part and parcel of our racial terror, that is the enslavement of people of African descent and the gross mistreatment and disrespect of Black women. So in order to really understand what's happening now, if you're not trying to have that conversation and really unpack that and how it shows up in your heart and in your behaviors and your actions, we have nothing. So to me, that's why we go back to these stances, to really try to unpack how we got here. Again, try to not locate it in the girls themselves as needing that they need the change, but what people are projecting onto them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you put that like that analysis of history and of current reality alongside what we already talked about with like the restorative justice labor, who's doing the labor in schools, it and who is most impacted by the harms created in schools often. It's that's quite the that's quite the research project.
It is
Um,
quite a research project.
yeah,
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 there's a wonderful new book I participated in just because of that question. Uh, Lori Patton Davis, Venus Evans Winter, Charlotte Jacobs have a book called Investing in the I don't know, education success of Black women and girls. It literally just came out, and I have a chapter in there that leverages the 5 pedagogical stances in thinking about this work and Futures Matter stance for Black girls.
yeah, yeah, yeah. What else have we not talked about that you'd like that you want to talk about?
Well, I would love to talk a little bit about kind of how I really love this idea, and I just love the work that's coming out of Zehr Institute. And, I'd love to know a little bit, Jonathan, we did this in our email exchange, but how this work has impacted the work that you do at Zehr, and if there's been aspects of the work that you've been able to leverage in your own teaching and practitioner work.
Yeah, yeah, no, that thank you for the question. I'm I'm relatively new to the role that I currently have with the Zehr Institute, but and just as I kind of as I reviewed for this conversation and again read the book again, I was thinking about like, well, what would it mean to take at least these 5 stances seriously from a community based practitioner level, like instead of it being like school based, like what would it mean to really engage communities around like the history of that place, which is some of the work that we're already that folks are doing, you know, around the country. Like this is where did our land come from, or not our land? Where did this land that we inhabit? Um, who who inhabited it before us? Those kinds of questions. And so I'm really looking forward to like getting the opportunity to kind of weave some of these concepts together, and we will definitely be connecting because I want to yeah, I want to pick your brain as well on some of those, but yeah, I love the introduction of new lenses, new ways to talk about paradigm shifts. I think are really helpful. I think because I think some of the work can feel stagnant. You know, like we've
Yeah.
been trying to do the same thing for so many years, and like nothing, you know, nothing seems like it changes. And then when you put on a different lens, a different use a different point of analysis, I think it actually creates lots of different potential avenues for practice. Um, yeah, so love that. Yeah, love those concepts. Thank you for bringing them into not into existence, because I think the concepts existed, but putting it in writing in the way that you have.
Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan. It's just, I'm always curious about how people take up the work, interpret the work, and are able to use it in the context that they're working in. And
Mm.
so, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah. What in general? So we talked just a little bit about kind of the future of restorative justice, but just in general, what are you hopeful for? What brings you hope? And maybe we'll end with this kind of question, and then we'll turn it over to Addison for some announcements, and I can close it up. But yeah, what's your hope for the future?
Oh, goodness.
Small, right? Just a small one.
Well, it's always with children,
Mm,
it's always with the children. Their honesty. I love young people. I like the way that they are um, working hard to make sure that um, us grown people are being accountable. They're watching us. They're wanting us to do better. They're wanting us to update our language, our naming practices, maybe even getting rid of some of the naming. I don't know, like just I feel like they're pushing us in ways that are really important, and I feel very hopeful by that.
Mm-hmm.
With that, I just feel like I'm learning from them all the time. I remember when I was teaching high school and I would tell the teens, I just said, everybody wants to be like you. I mean, everybody wants some piece of like they want your youth, they want your energy, they copy your styles, your ideas, your language. It's a beautiful thing. And so I think that our young people just give me some profound hope.
Yeah.
Their creativity, they're so creative. They're making things, they're creating things, they're building things, they're designing things. It's just incredible. They're crossing all kinds of contrived boundaries. It's very powerful.
Yeah. 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 Sometimes I wonder how much of our responsibility is just get out of the way, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
like don't hinder this. Don't put any barriers. Just get out of the way and let
Just
the
get out of the
young
way.
folks go.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And for this time of conversation, it's been wonderful.
This has been great.
Addison, are you ready for announcements? It sounds like you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I just wanted to first just say thank you so much to Professor Winn for sharing your knowledge and wisdom around RJE and RJ in general. I feel lucky to have been here. But before we totally close, I just have a few announcements to share. First of all, please visit the Zehr-institute.org/webinars for our spring webinar lineup. We've got 2 coming up, one in March and one in April. Okay, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR program, is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. While the global community continues to face turmoil and uncertainty, trauma and resilience education is as vital as ever. We are pleased to announce STAR 1 and STAR 2 are now online. Registration is available to join upcoming online trainings. A Level 1 and Level 2 course will be available through the Summer Peacebuilding Institute starting May 26th. Please visit emu.edu/cjp/star to get more information and register for upcoming sessions. After 2 years of online only, there will once again be in-person courses for the 2022 Summer Peacebuilding Institute. For a list of in-person as well as online courses, more information about scholarships to the Summer Peacebuilding Institute, changes related to COVID, and the metrics we will use if we feel we have to go online, go to https://emu.edu/SPI. If you're interested in learning more about restorative justice, we have several opportunities for you to study at Eastern Mennonite University through graduate degrees and certificates, such as the RJ Graduate Certificate, which is perfect for working professionals. EMU also offers studies that combine RJ and education, or RJE. Students pursuing a master's in education can get a restorative justice in education concentration, or similar to the previous slide, graduate certificates are also available for those interested in RJE. There are also master's degrees in conflict transformation, restorative justice, and the newly added program for transformational leadership. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners within their chosen field. For more information, visit emu.edu/cjp/grad. Last but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, the schedule of upcoming webinars, and a place where you can find past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. That concludes my announcements, so here's Jonathan with a few closing comments.
Thank you, Addison. And thank you once again, Maisha, for joining us for this conversation. for sharing your wisdom and yourself with us for this time. Thank you to the rest of you all who have been able to join us. Many apologies for our technical issues with the streaming, but we will have the video of this will be updated and on our YouTube site soon. And it will also be on the Zehr Institute webinar site soon. So thank you so much for joining us. And we will be in touch and be in communication and in relationship in the future.
Thanks, Jonathan.